All right, let's dive into something that's, well, it's incredibly tough. We're going to be talking about how the UK justice system deals with kids who commit serious, sometimes even violent crimes. It's one of those topics that really makes you question everything you think you know about justice, responsibility, and even what it means to be a child. So let's just start with a really big question, because it's at the core of this whole thing. When a kid commits a really serious crime, what's the first thing we should see? The child or the crime? Seriously, how you answer that question changes everything. And what we're going to see is that the UK's youth justice system is basically torn in two by how it tries to answer that very question.
Okay, Section 1, a child or a criminal, the two competing philosophies. This really gets to the heart of the matter. We're talking about two ideas that are constantly battling it out inside the UK's approach to youth justice, and it creates a system that's, frankly, pretty conflicted.
So here they are, side by side. On one hand, you've got the punitive view. This is all about seeing young offenders as a risk, something that needs to be managed. And the answer is punishment. Protect the public. Then, on the other hand, you have the rights-based view. This one says, hold on. First and foremost, this is a child with rights, a child who needs support, welfare, and help to get back on track. It's like a constant tug of war, pulling the whole system in two completely different directions.
All right, next up, the UNCRC Rights Framework, which is a key international benchmark. So how do we actually analyze this conflict? Well, experts don't just go on gut feelings, they use this really important international standard, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, or UNCRC for short. Think of it as a yardstick, a way to legally and ethically measure how a country is really doing when it comes to its kids.
Now, when it comes to serious crimes committed by young people, researchers zero in on a few core rights from the UNCRC. You've got Article 3, which is all about the best interests of the child. Article 12, their right to actually be heard. Article 40, which says justice systems have to be built for children, not just scaled-down adult ones. And then, there's the big one for our discussion today, Article 37.
And you really have to pay attention to the wording here. Article 37 is super clear. It says taking away a child's liberty, arrest, detention, prison, it has to be the absolute last resort. And if it happens, it has to be for the shortest possible time. This isn't just some nice idea, it's a direct command. A child's freedom and their chance to develop should come before punishment.
Okay, on to the UK system, the punitive model, and a rights-based critique. So now that we have that UNCRC framework in our heads, let's look at how the UK system actually stacks up. Scholars basically put the reality of UK youth justice side by side with these UN standards, and, well, the results are pretty eye-opening.
Let's start with just one number. 10. That's the age of criminal responsibility in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. A 10-year-old can be considered a criminal. Just let that sink in for a second. It is one of the absolute lowest in all of Europe.
And now, look at this number, 14. That's the minimum age the UN committee recommends. So you have 10 versus 14. That's a huge gap. And researchers say it's a massive problem. Why? Because slapping a criminal label on a young kid is so often tied to their vulnerability and tough background. And it just totally goes against the whole idea of having a justice system that's actually designed for children.
So what happens to the kids who do end up getting a custodial sentence? Where do they actually go? Well, in the UK, it's mainly two kinds of places. Young offender institutions, you'll hear them called YOIs, and secure training centres, or STCs. The real question is, what's it like inside?
And this is where the scholarly critique really hits hard. Research shows that the kids inside these places are often incredibly vulnerable to begin with. Then you hear about the use of pain-inducing restraint techniques, the practice of solitary confinement. I mean, come on. Scholars look at this and say, this isn't just bad policy, it's a breach of the rule against cruel punishment. And, most importantly, it shows that sending kids to these places is not a last resort. It's a direct violation of both the spirit and the actual text of Article 37.
But it's not all just about criticism. This brings us to the child-first alternative, a system built on rights. See, the research doesn't just tear things down. It actually proposes a totally different way of doing things. It's called the child-first model, and it's built from the ground up on those UNCRC principles we've been talking about.
And here's the absolute core of it, right here in this quote.
A child-first approach sees children who offend as children in need of support and inclusion, not simply as risky offenders. It's a total flip in perspective. Instead of risk management, it's child support. It's not about letting them off the hook, but about framing the entire response around what that child actually needs to get better.
And this isn't just a vague idea. It leads to a very clear plan. First, you dramatically reduce how much you rely on big custodial institutions. You phase out those prison-like YOIs and STCs altogether. What do you replace them with? Small, secure homes that are all about welfare and real support. You prioritize strong community options instead of just locking kids up. The whole focus shifts from punishment to dignity, development, and actually helping them become part of society again.
So this really nails the difference, doesn't it? It all comes back to how you interpret Article 37, that last resort rule. The current UK practice, with its big YOIs and focus on punishment, is always teetering on the edge of breaking that rule. But the child-first model, it's designed to follow it, to make sure that taking away a child's liberty is truly the very last thing you do, and for the shortest time imaginable.
And this child-first thinking doesn't stop at the institution doors. It goes right into the courtroom. The UNCRC says kids have a right to a fair trial that's appropriate for them and the right to be heard. But think about it. The reality? Researchers find that with all the complex legal language, the scary courtrooms, and now even remote hearings on a screen, kids often have no idea what's going on. They can't participate. They just become a passenger in a process that's deciding their entire future.
Which brings us back to where we started. What is justice for? The fundamental divide. We're getting to the end here, and you can see it's not just about changing a policy here or there. It's about answering that massive question. What is the entire point of youth justice? And how we answer that, well, it has huge real-world consequences for kids' lives.
You know, one of the key problems experts point to is this thing they call bifurcation. It basically means the system is split in two. If a kid does something minor, they might get a supportive, welfare-based response. But if they commit a serious crime, they get shunted onto this harsh, punitive, almost adult-like track. And here's the crazy paradox. It means the kids who are often the most vulnerable and in need of help are the ones least likely to actually get their rights protected.
And this table just lays it all out, plain and simple. Look at the rhetoric versus the reality. On one side, the official language is all child first, commitment to rights, protecting the vulnerable. Sounds great, right? But then look at the documented practice. Punitive custody is still happening. There's resistance to raising that age of responsibility. They're still using pain-inducing restraint. Scholars look at this massive gap between what's said and what's done and argue that, plain and simple, the UK is failing to meet its international obligations.
So let's end by circling back to that first question, but maybe let's put it a different way. Should youth justice be all about a child's past actions, or should it be about their future potential? Is the goal to punish what they did, or is it to build a future for them, to believe that even a child who has done something awful is still, at their core, a child with a future that's worth fighting for? How we answer that, well, that's everything.